Hello. Thank you for attending the Conference on Crimes Against Women's virtual conference. We are glad you have chosen to join us. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that if you have not done so already, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on crimes against women on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, or anywhere else podcasts are found. We have an amazing season 2 of topics and conversations relevant to crimes against women. And now for the session on silencing the non-state torture and trafficking organized and perpetrated within family systems. Let's get started. Linda MacDonald is a human rights defender and activist from Nova Scotia, Canada. In 1993, Ms. MacDonald started an independent nursing practice with Jeanne, Sarson, beginning by helping one woman heal from the crime of non-state torture, also known as NST, which began in infancy at the hands of her parents, other family members, and human traffickers. After co-founding Persons Against Non-State Torture, Ms. MacDonald has been contacted by hundreds of women globally who have endured NST. Now a world leader on the reality of NST, Ms. MacDonald speaks at the United Nations, educates internationally, trains caregivers, researches on NST, and has many published articles on this crime. Her primary goals are to raise awareness of this very invisible crime against women, advocate for laws globally on non-state torture, and promote NST victimization, traumatization, informed care, and prevention. Jeanne Sarson is a Canadian feminist human rights defender. In 1993, Ms. Sarson focused her practice on exposing and naming family-based non-state torture as a specific form of violence against women and girls. With Linda MacDonald, Ms. Sarson developed models explaining NST, gathering insights into the torturer's MO, and shaping NST victimization, traumatization, informed care when supporting women's recovery and freedom efforts. Welcome, Linda and Jeanne.
Thank you. It's Linda MacDonald and Jeanne Sarson. We're very appreciative of being invited by Crimes Against Women to speak at your conference. And today we're going to be talking about unsilencing. And what we're unsilencing is the non-state torture and human trafficking organized and perpetrated within family systems. To tell you a little bit about Jeanne and I'm Linda, and Jeanne will be speaking later. We're both nurses, retired now, who started in 1993 in Nova Scotia, Canada, in a small town of 14,000 people, listening to people talk about their experiences of some form of relational violence. We started it one night a week, and 6 months into our practice, a woman came to us, and after the third session in, we realized that she indeed did not endure abuse. She was suffering from torture. We could tell by the stories that she told. They were stories of torture. So this changed our worldview. We didn't realize that families do torture their children. This was back, remember, 28 years ago. We're hearing more stories about it now. But back then it was a very silent crime. And we proceeded to support her for many years and then listen to 5 other women in our province to get a framework around what the torture we were hearing. And then we advanced our practice to include activism and research and writing. And Jeanne will talk about a book that we're just about to have published. So we're thrilled to be able to share our expertise with you today. Thank you, Jeanne. Next slide. The goal, learning objectives of our sharing today are threefold. One is to name what non-state torture is, because maybe you still have not heard of the term and how that evolved. What acts are involved in non-state torture, the historical explanation of why non-state torture is rarely named and listed as a distinct crime or form of domestic violence, and the her stories that we have listened to, some of them, to unsilence their invisibilized population. So hopefully from today, you will feel you've learned those. If you look at our 10 facts about non-state torture, they're very to the point messages to give you sort of an overview of what indeed non-state torture is. It is a human rights violation. It's perpetrated within families. It is destructive to the sense of self. All torture is, whether it's state or non-state. The goal is intentional destruction of the person's sense of self. It happens to babies. Most of the women that we have listened to, and we've listened to over 1,000 women, and they talk about the torture that they endured when they were babies. When we first started doing the work, people didn't believe that people could have memories about babies, their baby trauma, but we know now that it's not the case. Women do remember what happened to them as babies. Children can be held captive. Non-state torture is a crime that is endured for years. Many of the women that we've listened to didn't escape until they were in their 20s. It is never work, because torture is never work. People cannot consent to torture. And in the work that we listen to women, they describe being tortured in prostitution. So that's why we say it's never work, because if you've endured torture in prostitution, that's not a job. Non-state torture occurs in sexualized exploitations and the human trafficking that we're talking about today. It's worldwide, because we've listened to women all over the world share their stories of non-state torture, and it must be made illegal. And there are very few crimes in the world that have specifically named non-state torture as a crime. If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 5 says that people have the right to be free from torture. So that means all people, men, women, and children. And this is the foundation of our human rights work as activists and as supporters, to stand with the women and say that they indeed deserve that right to be upheld, that they are not to endure torture. The naming of torture started in 2000, or non-state torture started in 2004. Jeanne and I started going to the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations in New York. And we spoke with some activists at the UN who introduced us to an acclaimed activist, Charlotte Bunch, who told us about the Amnesty International naming of non-state actors. This little booklet there, Women's Human Rights, it was written in 2000, and it talks about non-state actors, or perpetrators who are not employed by the state. They can be paramilitary, they can be family, they can be human traffickers. And so what we did is we took the term non-state actor and added torture to it, and now we call it non-state torture. So that's how the term non-state torture was coined. Okay, Jeanne. And people ask, why is the importance of naming torture? Well, it's so that the women can be heard and have the same language as everyone else. They know their crime is torture, and yet they're still being told that they're abused, and this is very discriminatory to them. So we're very insistent, and so are they, that their crime be named as torture. And one of the women that we support, Elizabeth, she explains how she feels when a listener ignores her disclosure of non-state torture victimization. She says, I do speak about torture. Sometimes I feel so isolated, like being in a place that no one talks my language, and I have to keep relating their language, even though it is not my language. It's a social isolation difficult to describe. So that's why it's important to name non-state torture. Thanks, Jeanne. This is the patriarchal divide that we developed to show people what non-state torture is, which is the torture of women and children, primarily by the everyday person. The difference between state torture and non-state torture is not the acts. They are comparably the same. It is where that the acts happen. One can happen in the home, in a hotel, in a hut in the desert. And state torture often happens with the military, in embassies, with prisoners of war, or in police stations. And also the difference between state torture and non-state torture are the perpetrators. As I said, it can be police or military. And with non-state torture, the crime is perpetrated by families, by family friends, strangers that they traffic them to, pornographers, pimps involved in prostitution, or the buyers in prostitution. So if we look at the two crimes, we can see that electric shocking happens in both. Being brutally beaten and whipped happens in both. Mobilization tortures such as caging and being hung. Water torture, which we heard a lot about in Abu Ghraib. but indeed it happens in non-state torture as well. And I was talking to a woman on Facebook this week who Jeanne and I have supported, and she described when she was in prostitution, she was submerged in a tub to be under the water and raped at the same time. So that is the sexualized violence and water torture happening at the same time, a horrendous crime. There's suffocation and choking tortures, and nowadays we hear suffocation and choking as kinky sex or BDSM or breathing games, but really it is a form of non-state torture that women are suffocated and tortured, and this can be going on when they're raped as well. Gang rapes, rapes by one individual, rape with a gun or a hand or other objects. Those are all sexualized tortures that happen in both. Forced drugging is very, very common, even with small children. Nutritional deprivation of food and water, psychological tortures, humiliation, degradation, bestiality, forced nakedness, sleep deprivation, the witnessing of others being tortured. And we hear that in both state and non-state, this is very difficult for survivors to hear, and a sense of powerlessness. Okay, Jeanne. Now you see the universal assessment questionnaire that Jeanne and I developed with 48 different lists of what happens in non-state torture to help women identify what happened to them personally in their lives. And what they do is they tick off the boxes of what really happened. And often they can name up to 20, some are up to 48. It depends on the person. But they use this questionnaire as a way to validate that they've been tortured, and they take it with them when they speak, when they share their story. It's an affirmation of the crime that they've endured and the grave human rights violation. And they all really coincide with the listing that I showed you before, just in more details, like being placed in a freezer, forced impregnation, forced abortion, being vomited on, prevented from using the toilet. These are all different forms of non-state torture that women identify. Thank you, Jeanne. So when the United Nations developed the Universal Declarations, which was led by Eleanor Roosevelt, people have to remember that it was written for all men at the time. And these women from different countries of Poland and Lebanon, India, Dominican Republic, and Eleanor Roosevelt herself, they insisted that women had to be included in the language. So the language went from all men to the equal rights of men and women, and from no man to no one. So even in a document that's supposed to support anti-discrimination, women and girls were discriminated in that document, and boys too, because they didn't mention boys, it was only men. So this is a historical explanation of how important the Universal Declaration is, that no one shall be subjected to torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Okay, Jeanne. And in our unsilencing work, you'll see a picture of Jeanne there where she was sitting at her phone. When we first started this work, and 28 years ago, we only had the phone and email. Now we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have YouTube, we have Zoom, we have Skype. So we connect with women from all over the world now. From the United States, many women from the United States have contacted us. Of course, our own country of Canada, from the UK, from the EU, from Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, the Philippines, from Africa. And Jeanne and I were speaking with a woman 2 or 3 weeks ago from Papua New Guinea, describing the sorcery torture that the women in Papua New Guinea are enduring. Okay, Jeanne. Here is the image of 4 women that will be sharing their stories around their victimization and trafficking. One is Sarah, the first woman that came to us. Then Lynn, who Jeanne and I worked with in Nova Scotia. Alex, who was a Canadian and now lives in the States. And Sophie, who was a young woman from the United States and trafficked to Europe. Their drawings of themselves, except for the one of Lynn where it was a photo and we did an image of her in that way. Their artistry is different. Each person is unique, but drawing is very important in their healing because many women can't start with talking, they'll start with drawing. Okay, Jeanne. So if you look at Sarah's questionnaire, she's ticked off 48 plus others that she added. All 48 she endured. So this tells you that it was a grave suffering that she endured, and she was conditioned to self-harm and to die by suicide if she ever told. She was objectified by being marked on, and her worldview was gravely distorted by the psychological tortures, that she felt she was alone and no one cared about her. And this all happened over a period of 30 years. In her main perpetrators were her family system. Next one, Jeanne. Then we have Sarah drawing of being rented out, she called it. She was a little 2-year-old sitting on the counter of her father's corner store. The line of people or the people, men and women, who came to torture her, knowing that she'd been groomed for torture. So her father was trafficking her in that way. The bottom image on the left is of non-state torture and pornography. You'll see the camera person there. And they were playing Tie a Yellow Ribbon as the music to condition her. And the markings are the way they marked her on her body. They drugged her and sadistically tortured her, and bestiality was involved as well. And pornography was used as an educational tool for children, often to teach them how to endure pornography when it was their time to be tortured in the pornography. And she was trafficked transregionally. This is an estimation of how many torture rapes she endured over a 20-year period, which came to a total of almost 24,000, including the vaginal raping, the oral and anal rapes, and then the trafficking and prostitution rapes. And that doesn't even include the group and torture gang rapes, the object rapes, bestiality, and leap year, which she dreaded because it was an extra year of raping and torture. So here's a young woman who in her 20 years endured over 23,000, almost 24,000 rapes. How anyone could call this abuse is beyond Jeanne and I. Okay, Jeanne. So this is Sarah's story about on the boat when she was 14. She was as a captivity story. Her parents trafficked her to this powerful man, and he would shock things out, electric shocking, and throw you down, hit you, make all kinds of bruises with tools like whips, chains, knives, and guns, which are the physical torture. He blindfolds you so you don't know what you're doing, the psychological torture. He sticks you with a broken bottle in your ribs and sucks the blood. He says, smile, which is multi-tortured. He had a big black dog, the bestiality. He gets food, does not give it to you, no water either. That's a deprivation. He puts you in a cage, throws you overboard, drags the cage in the water with the boat. He drowns you, which is the water torture. He pulls you up, throws you on the deck, rapes you, and you were supposed to say you wanted more. Those were the sexualized and physical and sexualized psychological tortures. So you can see in this one event, there was a huge amount of torture that she endured. Lynn's story, she was held captive and tortured and trafficked and exploited in prostitution by her legal husband and 3 males for 4.5 years. She was tortured by the buyers, including 10 policemen with guns. And she can remember them taking turns at gang raping her. And when they finished, she felt utterly destroyed. She escaped after 4.5 years and didn't really share her story with anyone until I met her as a nurse and a care coordinator. And it took her 2 years to tell Jeanne and I her whole story of how she was tortured and exploited and trafficked. And she died of MS, but she died in peace, knowing that she was cared about and respected and believed. Okay, Jeanne. So this is Lynn's questionnaire, and you can see all the boxes that she ticked off, including that she was forcibly impregnated 5 times and 5 forced abortions. She almost died from those. She was groomed, and she even was forced to cut herself with razor blades. And she had phalangia, you can see ticked off there, the soles of the feet beaten, which is a common name for state torture, phalangia. And by beating women's feet, they can't escape. So it's also not just for pleasure and for harming, but also for protection to keep them from escaping. Okay, Jeanne. This is Alex. She drew a picture of herself after she was forcibly aborted and forced to eat some of the fetal tissue. They did an abortion, made me eat some of it. She believed she was evil inside, and that's a drawing of her feeling evil inside. Of course, we know that's a distortion, but it's a powerful way to keep someone silent if they feel that evil. And in 2000, we did a participatory research questionnaire on impregnation, abortion, and forced ingestion of fetal tissue. And you'll see there that 56% of them stated being raped during forced abortion or torture, and also 43% were forced to swallow the aborted tissue. So it's much more common than people would understand. Next one, Jeanne. So this is Sophie, the young girl that we talked about that was 17. She was trafficked over to the EU from New York City, and she was forced to believe that she was fat and ugly and a slut and all kinds of psychological tortures that are not true. And we helped her to reframe her sense of self. Now, this started when she was 8, remember? So she was very little. And we received an email from her supporter years later saying that she is happy, enthusiastic participant in life, and that she hasn't considered killing herself for a long time. She's graduated with a master's degree in nursing and thanked us for her kindness. So we share Sophie's story for you to understand that women can heal. They can heal from anything if they can heal from torture, non-state torture. Okay, Jeanne. And 3 acts of mental state torture are the derogatory names, put downs, and treated as non-human. Many of the women describe themselves as an it. They don't really see themselves as a person because they've been so dehumanized. And you can see from our participatory research findings that indeed 92% were called derogatory names, 92% endured put downs, and 85% were treated as non-human. So this kind of mental non-state torture is very, very common and very, very long-term in the effects that it creates on the woman and girl's psyche. And this was an image that Elizabeth, one of the women that you're going to hear today in speaking, she showed the 128 everyday objects that were used as torture tools in her home. And you can see some of them: a bucket, an electric light bulb, a bed, a screwdriver, handcuffs, a belt. And so when you're investigating a crime, cigarettes are very common for cigarette burns. When you're investigating a crime in the home of a family, you wouldn't often think of these as crime tools for torture, but they are. And they can be missed unless the women are listened to about the story of what happened to them when they were children or even when they are children. Okay, Jeanne. This is the multi-layering of violence against women and girls within human trafficking and families. They have 3 layers: the community face, the family face, and the inner circle face. The community face they create to have a persona of being this highly respected person. They can be an elder in church, a politician, a respected volunteer in the community. And then they have their family face where they're parents and grandmothers and uncles and aunts and liked by other families. And then they have their inner circle, which is the torture of their torture crime. And where they do this, like we mentioned, they can be family, friends, pornographers, traffickers. And where they do the crime is they can have a torture room in the basement. They torture in the apartments, in motels, hotels, cabins, boats, fields, RVs, anywhere where they can take children and people will not suspect that they're being tortured. And why do they do it? Well, the main reason that we've learned is for pleasure. They do it for domination, for control, for profit, of course, when there's human trafficking involved. And they do it for prestige within their inner circle group because, if they can offer up a child to a powerful person for trafficking, that gives them prestige within their group. In our participatory research questionnaire, we ask people whether they think there's a difference between abuse and torture, and often it's not a crime that they've ever thought of before, but it's one we want people to think about because we want them to understand that there is indeed a distinct difference between the two crimes and human rights violations. And hopefully you will agree after you've seen all of the different examples of the non-state torture that I've shared with you today, and Jeanne will continue to share. And it turns out that the respondents do agree that there is a distinct difference between the two crimes. 90% of the time they say yes, they believe that torture is different than abuse or assault, which we call it legally often assault. And the reasons are given, some examples here on the right-hand box, where torture is a dehumanization, that there's a severe mental and physical pain and suffering involved. The intensity of the terror and horror is just absolutely horrendous. As I mentioned before, the destruction of the sense of self, which we know is the intentional act of torture. That's even been defined by the United Nations that way. And the destruction of being a human, when I explained about them feeling like an it or non-human, and that the degree of humiliation and anguish is different than for torture, for abuse. And now this is Elizabeth, a woman that Jeanne and I support, and she's really pretty well healed from torture and writing her own book on non-state torture. And a few years back at the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, we made a video of Elizabeth asking her what the importance of naming non-state torture was. So you will hear her in her own words and see her in the video describing what the naming has done for her. And thank you very much. After the video, then Jeanne will carry on with the second part of our panel presentation. So Elizabeth, what is the naming of non-state torture and the framework around it meant to you in your life?
What it has meant is that since I was very little, I suffered torture harms, and those torture harms didn't have a name, so they stayed silent and I couldn't speak about them. And then when I learnt what torture was and what acts were torture, I realised that I had been tortured, and that gave me the possibility to feel that what I'd suffered had a name and could be recognised and validated.
So before you had the framework and the naming, how was your life?
It was partitioned off because I didn't have a way of describing what had happened to me. So I couldn't fit what had happened to me into words that were in the general use, like sexual abuse or assault. That didn't fit. Incest kind of covered a bit of it but didn't really fit. So I forgot the rest of the question, sorry.
That's So now that you have the naming and the framework,
Yeah.
how has your life changed from how you described it was before? What has the naming and the framework done to change your life, or has it changed your life?
Well, it has changed my life completely because I've understood the ordeals that I've suffered, like being caged or being hung and tied up, and the deprivation of food and sleep and verbal tortures. I've understood those, so I've been able to name them, and that's meant that I've been able to feel heard, listened to for what actually happened to me, and that's meant I've been able to grieve, and that's given me freedom. So it's meant that I can live my life and know that, tragic as it was, that I was a torture survivor of torture at home. It gives me visibility in a way, because I can actually talk to the reality of my childhood, and that somehow gives me pride. I know it seems strange, but it does, because it gives me a voice that recognises my own experiences and what happened to me. And then I can talk to other people, and then I can say, actually, I don't want this happening to other children, and then we can work to fight and stop it.
So do you have a dream for your future around, you know, the reality of non-state torture or your life? What are your dreams now, or your main dream for your life?
Well, my main dream is I've got several main dreams, but one of my main dreams is to look after myself and to give myself lots of kind nature enjoyment experiences for the rest of my life, and my other biggest dreams are that I would like non-state torture to be recognised as a form of violence against women and girls, and I'd like to be able to look at my local rape crisis centre, or actually nationally and internationally, and see on the list, have you suffered non-state torture? This is what it is. And then I would like to imagine that if that had been me all those years ago, I'd have been able to walk into a centre and say, yes, I suffered that, and please can you give me help for that and support. So that's one of my main dreams. NST-informed care.
It's a big dream.
Yeah.
It's a great dream.
But also I'd like us to educate our young people so that they understand what torture is, and then that way, if they are suffering that at school, or their teachers can be educated about it too and have awareness, that they would pick that up. And then what happened to me, which was that it went on, there wasn't a framework for it, so it went unrecognised, undetected and unspoken about for so many years that it should never have really, I mean, it couldn't have been otherwise, but it shouldn't happen like that. A young person should go on suffering that without anyone finding them. So lots of education.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
You're welcome, Linda.
So thank you, Linda, and we were most appreciative of Elizabeth and her willingness to do the very spur of the moment video with us to share how important naming her victimization has been to her life. So for this part of our presentation, the learning objectives are again around naming, but this time it's around putting a name to the type of care that we have developed over the 28 years that began with Sarah. Because when we started with Sarah, as Linda explained, there was not even a name such as non-state torture, and it wasn't even recognized that torture was happening in families. So we were really at ground zero, that we were trying to understand how we were going to help Sarah. And we told her that we had no experience and that we could not find any other resources in our province, or even close enough that she could have her accessed. And when we wrote to different establishments to ask them some questions, we did get one response back. So they asked us how we were doing. And when we explained how the care was going, they said, well, obviously we were doing the right caring, so to continue. So this is what we're sharing in this section. This is a entry level really discussion. So we're sharing some of the main and most simple, if you will, simple. I use that sparingly, simple in the fact that it's quite easy to be respectful to other people, and that should not be hard to maintain somebody else's dignity and respect. But sometimes it seems that that seems too simple to do, to be a caring intervention, but it is. So the responses and the explanations, we'll briefly talk about post-traumatic stress response. We don't call it a disorder, we call it response. I'll explain a little bit about that. Dissolving dissociative survival responses, how important that is. The fact that women can experience vicarious trauma and have grief, and the issue of social integration. So how do we care? So the non-state torture, victimization, traumatization, informed care. It names the care that the person who has been tortured by private individuals or groups needs to be able to access. That was point one. Point two, it names her victimization. By saying non-state torture victimization, what we are saying to her is that she suffered a crime, and it puts the responsibility on the torturers. And by naming the fact that she was victimized by the crime of non-state torture, is what we're talking about, it can eliminate her self-blaming, because she's been told over and over and over again that the torture was her fault. That's what she deserved. She was nothing. So she was conditioned, if you will, to self-blame, that somehow if society isn't even acknowledging that torture happens by private individuals in a family, she's not hearing any other knowledge to start questioning how she feels about herself. And the other thing, that by naming it in the title, victimization, she needs her victimization listened to if she wants to tell. And globally, the global standard is from the UN special rapporteurs who listen to people who have been state tortured. What has been learned is they really need to be able to talk about their torture victimization. This appears much more important to be able to talk about their victimization than it does about the trauma. And this is, Linda, in my experience too, over the last 28 years. The women needed to be able to disclose and understand what was done to them. And the third point is naming her traumatization. That is, how did she survive? What did her body, what did her mind do? What did her cells in her body have to do to keep her surviving and to keep her safe? So one of the questions we can ask ourselves, if we ourselves were in this position, what would we expect ourselves to respond like? And that's what we say to the women, you know, what the trauma that you developed as a consequence of the victimization, those are normal responses that kept you alive. So they have to be valued. And that's why we replace post-traumatic stress disorder, which is like telling the woman that there's something wrong with her for having the responses she does have, to understanding her post-traumatic stress responses. And the women say that's very important in their healing. So another way to think about how important it is to name the victimization, the non-state torture victimization, traumatization, informed care, is to see it as one, that the criminal victimization occurred. That means there were violations to local, national, and transnational human rights crime. And the trauma she developed was a consequence of the victimization. They go together. That's the only way she survived. And the trauma informed, when we're talking about crimes against humanity, which torture is, we can talk about very serious disasters that occur in our everyday lives, such as flood and hurricane or an earthquake that changes our environment in a way that is shocking to our sense of being. So there's trauma related to how one copes with that. So there's a difference here. One is the criminalization occurs, the other is a natural disaster, and both have trauma related to the event that occurred in their life. So the power of naming non-state torture, the simple, if you will, the simple, I say again, the first step begins with reflective language. So if a woman says to you, if you're listening to her, that she was tortured, this is how we need to respond. We need to say, I hear you're telling me that you survived torture, in this case, non-state torture. You need to say, I believe you and that I am so sorry. Because what has happened, women say that they say to a professional, I was tortured, and what they hear back, so the professional says, you were abused. That's not what they said. So this is the importance of respecting reflective language, because reflective language nurtures their human dignity and their human right, that they're being heard, so it validates them as a person. So that's the power of contributing to their personhood healing. By these three simple sentences, a person can contribute to their healing. So if you're working where there's records being kept, when records are being kept, we ask that you put torture, not abuse, if they told you they were tortured. With Sarah, which Linda introduced earlier, the first woman that came to us, one day she was looking at her chart and she had told the caregivers that she was tortured. And on her chart, it said abused. She had gone into the hospital for surgery and she told the staff that she did not want her family in the room. When she woke up, her family was all there. So reflective language and respecting what you're being told is very, very important, because that means she can start developing a trust of the institution, of the professionals, instead of still feeling that she can't trust anyone in the world or any institution. And when we don't listen, it's a put down. It's the mental torture gets triggered again. It conveys disrespect. It invalidates them as a person, and it hurts. And it increases their social anger. As women heal, when they realize what happened to them, they're angry. They're angry that society hasn't listened. And in Canada, we don't have a law on non-state torture, so that they tell us it makes them feel that they don't even fit, that society itself doesn't want to acknowledge what happened to them. And the dismissiveness, the tortures dismiss them all the time. So if we're not listening to them, they have that same dismissiveness that occurs. So this is an image of cellular memory, and we call it body talk. As Linda said, they don't often realize they're a person. They often see themselves as an it, as a nothing, like Sophie said, but their body does not forget that they are a human being. And what happens in order to survive, that's their survival responses. Their body disassociates the torture pain, the emotional terror, and the emotional horror. But as they're healing, their body starts remembering. It starts feeling safe for them to start understanding what happened to them. So this is a list of different types of torture, non-state torture, that different women have told us. And I can give you an example at the top there. There's burning eyes from irritants. Sarah, for example, had irritants put in her eyes, and she said to us one day that it looked like rain drops on them. She was looking through a window with raindrops on it. that's how it was affecting her in her memory. But on the positive, I can tell you that one day working outside with Sarah, all of a sudden she said, wow, look at the trees. Look at the trees, the leaves are turning all different colors. That's when Linda and I first learned that she was seeing only in black and white or gray. That's what she told us, or red for her when she was bleeding, when she was tortured and bleeding. But that's how cellular memory shuts down for them to survive. And as they're healing, it wakes up for them to start engaging in the world differently. So this is a list. They can have pains in their joints because of the dislocation of their joints, sore ribs when they're sat on, when they're orally raped and sat on. They have trouble breathing, so they'll feel like they're choking and they're struggling to survive. They can have chest pain when the memory is coming. Sore wrist, bladder symptoms. Often children, when they've been repetitively sexualized victimization, they may have bladder infections. And when the memory comes as a woman, they may have the same symptoms, and they could go to a physician and the urine test would be negative. So it could be a memory. So it's really important that we can say to women, this may be a cellular memory. It may be your body talking to you, telling you that there's healing going on. Because what happens as their sensory system wakes up, it releases the pain that it disassociated and reproduces the same physical responses. So the chemical non-state torture of forced drugging, it seemed to be a standard for the women that we spoke with. Often cocktails, polydrugging with many different drugs. And what we found out is that these responses for the drugging can come in and interfere with their life after they've exited and when they've no longer being victimized. But if they don't understand that this is what's happening to them, they start to worry that there's something wrong with them, that they start getting drowsiness and sleep for long periods, which was a recovery from the polydrugging, that they may have slurred speech, they may be mute, their eyelids will drop, their eyes close, their eyes go up into their head. You can watch their eyes roll up into their head. And for Sarah, she was the first that we said to her, noticing her eyes, we said to her, where are your eyes, Sarah? And she said, in the back of my head. So from that point on, whenever we could see her eyes change, go to the back of her head, we would bring that up. And eventually she got to understand the physical sensation of her eyes going to the back of her head. And when she developed that awareness, she had to learn to heal that, because going to the back of her head was a sign that she disassociated. So that made her vulnerable to chronic re-victimization. So if she met a perpetrator when she was grocery shopping and the perpetrator came up to her and said something, if she still had that response, she was at risk, very serious risk of being re-victimized, trafficked, and tortured. So she learned how to stop that disassociative response. It's a very important intervention. The fact that they'll fall asleep, they may start talking to you, and the next thing they're not talking and they appear to be sleeping, but they're not sleeping. It's a drugging response from the past. They may say they have Raggedy Ann feelings, that they're dizzy, they're feeling drunk or unbalanced. You may notice them walking that they're unbalanced. And with Sarah, she was one person that we worked with in person. Many of the women we worked through the internet on Skype. But with Sarah in our province, we were person to person, and she went to 2 episodes of temporary paralysis and the sensation of blindness that we had to stay present with her as the drugging response healed. It took about 15 or 20 minutes with each of these episodes for her to come back into herself. And if this ever happens with someone you're working with or around the chemical torture, to understand that if they're trying to tell you about what happened to them, that could be a trigger. And it could trigger a flashback, because one of the main interventions that the torturers had was to torture the women when they were little girls, never to tell. And if they did tell, to die by suicide, because the torturers never wanted to get caught. So that was their intent. So the drugging responses, like I've given you a list, and these are some examples on that list. The bottom one, collapses head to the table. We were sitting in a restaurant with one woman one day, and she was talking, and the next thing she collapsed her head onto the table. We understood it was chemical drugging, so we talked her through that. So the intervention for talking through someone to help them keep training themselves not to go into the memory of chemical drugging is to keep calling them by name, to keep saying their name, like we would say to Sarah, Sarah, you'll be okay. Sarah, try to open your eyes. Have them focus on the room, the color of the walls, the objects in the room, and to make sure they're sitting down, because if they're feeling dizzy or feeling wobbly on their feet, they have to sit down to be safe if you're talking through the internet with them. So we ask them to look at their feet, move their feet on the floor, rub their feet on the floor to see if they can gather some sensation. See that her toes move, see that she can move her knees, move her legs. That's a way of trying to get her to connect with her body, to stay present. And we don't ask her to look at her hands. And the reason for that is because several reasons. Number one, she could have blood in her hands from having been cut herself or from the sexualized violence and torture that she endured. And the other reason is that her hand, she was forced to touch people in ways that were very victimizing. So that could reinforce a stronger trigger and a stronger flashback. So we do not ask her to look at her hands. The other very common thing may be that they may say that they have hearing voices. So one of the interventions for that is to help them separate with the question, whose voice are you hearing? Are you hearing the torturer's voices? Or are you hearing your voice? And generally speaking, if they're hearing the torturer's voice, that's like a record. It plays over and over again. Just like Sophie said, she was taught to think she was a whore, a slut, that she was ugly, worthless, a fucking slut again, a nothing. So that's the voices of the perpetrators. So one thing you can do very quickly is ask her to think of one statement about herself that's truth-telling. And it can be this simple, if you will. What color is your hair? I have gray hair, but she may have brown hair. That's a reflection of herself that connects her to her body again, to herself. And she can start to separate her voice from the perpetrator, the torturer's voice. The vicarious trauma that occurs as she integrates the reality of her victimization, it starts to create awareness, knowing about the intentionality of the tortures, that this was not an accident, this was intentional, and it was pleasurable for the tortures. The women tell us that all the time, that they know there was pleasure. Realizing the degree of atrocities she suffered, that is new, because when she disassociated, it was like what was happening to somebody else, not herself. And the other thing with integration is the re-experiencing of the past, the smells, the sounds, the sights, the touch. But as I explained earlier, as her senses awaken, if you will, the past comes in, but also what happens is the present comes in. They can start looking at the world and making different connections. So the vicarious trauma comes because she becomes a witness to her own victimization as the disassociation heals. And of course, with that comes losses and the grief of understanding how impacted her life was as a child and how it is as an adult. And for Sarah, she had some very moving statements. She said, it's the knowledge, the images, the feelings, the pain of reality. It gets worse because the reason Sarah was saying this, it took quite a long time for her to really understand the degree of her victimization. It can start with a small thing like my parents took all my salary, so I didn't have enough money for food, until they understand the torture that they endured. It takes some time. So the reality is so unimaginable, but so personal. And that's because they realize it happened to them. And reliving wasn't as bad as remembering. So reliving, if the torture pain comes back with a memory, it may last a week, but they never forget. The remembering is always there. They'll remember for the rest of their life what happened to them. And that's what Sarah meant there. So if you're working with outreach or working with children, many of the indicators can be similar to a child who is at risk of being abused or is abused. What might be different is the bottom one here, going into the black. Women tell us that when they were torture raped, that the excruciating pain made them faint or go unconscious. And that's how they experienced that unconsciousness as going into the black. And as adults, that's how they talk to Linda and I. It was a sense of going into the black. So different women have used this statement. So we know that's an important statement to pay attention to. Also at the bottom is selling drugs there. Some women told us that in high school they were drug sellers, that their family had forced them to sell drugs. The strange behaviors or missing school or covering up injuries by overdressing, or if their behaviors were misunderstood by the teacher, perpetrator parents always had an excuse. They could lie to say that the child was on drugs and didn't take her medication, that she had emotional issues, and that explains why she's acting like she is. Some of them did try to run away, but because they weren't listened to, weren't understood, that non-state torture wasn't even a conscious reality back in 1993. When Sarah came, she was 30 then, but as a child, she said she tried to run, but she was not believed. The issues of in school, lapses of memory, that they couldn't remember their schoolwork. Sarah said when she was asked by teachers to draw her family, she copied because she knew she could never draw her own family, what she perceived it as, which were all the perpetrators, family and non-family, that they were connected to. So those sometimes had them labeled as not as bright as they really were, because the women that we have supported, they're very, very brilliant. It's their brilliance that we say that helped them survive. And the talking, for example, the speaking of gibberish, when a child is drugged, it's very hard for them to really hear what is being said. So some of it, the perpetrators talk in gibberish too. It's confusing. It makes their victimization harder to comprehend. And for some, they say they have gone mute in school because of the horror they witnessed or endured. And the discrimination and stigmatization, we did a survey in 2010, and we had 96 people who responded. And of the ones who responded, this is what the main issues were. They had difficulty finding appropriate support or help. So that's the reason we say it's non-state torture, victimization, traumatization, informed care. You have to know what they suffered. They weren't able to seek justice. That's why in Canada, we're trying to have our country change the law. They're not believed, they're given negative labels. They're treated as if they're crazy, they're not listened to, they're ignored, or they're automatically medicated. So the simple, again, because simple helps, person-to-person conversation, woman-to-woman talk, because if they were harmed as children, person-to-person conversation didn't happen either. And if they were caught in their family into adulthood, woman-to-woman conversation didn't happen. So that's a very important intervention, person-to-person conversation. And if we don't talk openly and transparently about the reality of non-state torture, they don't have any other knowledge to refer to. So that's why they would tell us, well, this is all I knew. This was my norm. This is what I grew up with. This as an adult is all I understood. So it helps them understand who they are, to have this person-to-person conversation and to be understood. And it helps prevent the social isolation, because social rejection is very painful. The research is showing us that emotional pain is as strong as physical pain. So who I am, like Linda said, they seldom do not know they're even a human being. And that's the first time we said to Sarah, you're a human being. She said, I didn't know that. Nobody ever told me that. And of course, they were never treated like that. So their perception is really extremely hurt. So this is what is important to them, is to remember that they're not crazy and not to treat them like they are. And for us, it seems people have trouble saying torture. So an intervention, if you're finding you're having trouble saying torture, non-state torture, practice saying it aloud. Look in the mirror and say, I can say torture. I can say non-state torture. I can hear a person telling me that and I can repeat it. That's truth affirming. To hear them, to acknowledge what they're saying, to understand their responses are normal survival and essential. That's what got them through the horror and the terror and the torture they survived. Understand that they're just learning to understand they are a person, that they're not a thing, and that they have human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Linda showed you at the beginning, is really an essential intervention healing tool for them. And also, they say that they felt like a freak, and that was Elizabeth when she's saying that if she talks torture language and the person that's listening isn't talking the same language, it's like, I feel like a freak, I don't belong. So the issue of having the right language, respecting that they're persons, respecting that they have to have this conversation is critical in their healing. And about the law, we have non-state torture there separated in a box because the non-state torture law is different than the neglect law, the assault law, the abuse law, the human trafficking law, how harassment is defined in the criminal code, how femicide is defined, and femicide is the killing of women and girls because they are women and girls, and how strangulation or choking may be defined in your criminal code. So the non-state torture, that is why we say that the law has to also identify torture that's perpetrated by non-state actors or state actors. They have to have equal knowledge in the criminal code. And just last month, 2 women who suffered non-state torture, were trafficked, have been working to have the law changed in South Dakota. So last month they had huge success. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that torture of a human trafficking victim became their law, a felony, a class 1 felony. And the two women standing in the photo is Kelly Patterson and Jeanne Dovak. And they gave their testimony. And we have their testimony. It's an open testimony. So that will be played for you to hear how eloquent and how caring they were to try to make sure that their criminal code was changed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify on Senate Bill 148. My name is Kelly Patterson, and I'm the Executive Director of Treasured Lives in Rapid City, which is a nonprofit organization that provides services to trafficking survivors. Additionally, I serve as co-chair for the Law and Policy Committee of the West River Human Trafficking Task Force. However, today I would like to speak to this bill personally as a survivor myself of sex trafficking in the state of South Dakota, and also as one who endured many forms of torture while being trafficked from preschool age until my escape at the age of 22. I was groomed in this state by ring trafficking, which is basically criminal enterprise. Those still exist and still operate in our state. I believe that you have all received the handout listing the 48 common forms of torture that are found in sex trafficking. I assume and hope that you find most of these things horrific, and you may even find many of them shocking. But for me, I have rarely met a trafficking victim who has not suffered several of these torture techniques, and many of them multiple times, including myself. This isn't an easy bill to testify on, as you can imagine. Sexualized torture is violence beyond abuse, and it's often accompanied by other forms of psychological torture. When torture is added to sexual abuse and perversion, the trauma is multiplied exponentially. The torture that I personally endured has taken a great toll on my health, along with bouts of flashbacks, nightmares, and post-traumatic stress to this day. Being punished through torture is very ritualistic and routine for most sex trafficking victims, regardless of who the handlers or traffickers might be. There was constant trauma of not knowing what would anger or disappoint the traffickers. There were certain rules that you learned quickly, but were constantly changing. It's never a one-time event. Rather, it's a constant in your life, both day and night, while trapped in that type of slavery. Not knowing where the landmines are put me in a state of extreme hypervigilance. These acts are committed intentionally for the purpose of inflicting punishment, to intimidate or coerce, and to dehumanize the child or adult that is being tortured and sold, along with a variety of other reasons. Please send the message to traffickers and buyers that this atrocious behavior will be severely punished in the state of South Dakota. I urge you to vote yes on SB 148. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Jeanne Dvorak, and I'm the director of Treasured Lives in Rapid City, and I'm also a survivor of childhood commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify, as we so often don't have a voice in any of the things that happen to us. As a small child, many of these torture tactics were used on me in order to force me to comply with my traffickers. My trafficker was actually my father, and my trafficking began at a very, very young age, and it ended when I was 7.5 years old. So if you can imagine, these things have had a very lasting effect on me as they started so young. They were cruel, humiliating, and damaging to myself and so many others who have also experienced this kind of torture. It was damaging not only physically, but mentally and emotionally. And as a 56-year-old woman, I still suffer complex trauma from these torture tactics. The effects are far-reaching and very difficult to overcome. No human being should ever be allowed to treat another human being in such inhumane ways, but especially in an effort to force them into sexual exploitation. I implore you to take a stand in defense of the defenseless and show them that their pain matters by saying yes to SB 148. Thank you so much for allowing me to testify.
And the tool that they used is this, our Universal Assessment Questionnaire. They took that with them. They gave it to the senator that was standing with them. And that was the governor signing the law, actually, the woman seated in the middle of the photo. And they talked about that. And when the lawyers and the senators were discussing that, they brought up this questionnaire and said, well, if women check this off, or people, any person who was tortured, if they check this off, that would be clear to identify, to know that they were tortured. It becomes very visible. And this is how in their criminal code the law will be. So for anyone who's working in law, you can look that up and you'll see that they have a definition of the term torture. And our resources, they're in our handout that you can access. These are some examples. We have a postcard around that torture happens here, and you'll see in different houses, different shapes of houses, hotels, whatever, non-state torture can happen anywhere where there are perpetrators. And like Linda said, we seem to have them perpetrators in many, many countries on this planet. And on the back of the postcard, there's a list of different forms of non-state torture. So it's an educational tool, and it's linked in on our handout. And this is our non-state torture wheel and fact sheet and an infographic. And again, these are on our handout LinkedIn, and they can be downloaded. And the non-state torture wheel is like a 2-page fact sheet. And what happens here, there's 8 elements, like physical, sexualized, use of animals, use of drugs, spiritual and ritualized, use of children. If it's an adult that's being tortured, they may have children, so they use the children. And the financial torture keeps them poor, keeps them not accessing support, and the verbal torture, which we've spoken of. And this is the Women's Human Rights Teaching and Learning and Advocacy resource. It was just launched. We and many women worked with an NGO in New York to create 42 teaching modules that can be downloaded and used to educate others on human rights. Many, many different modules. And we worked on the module on freedom from violence, stigma, and stereotype. And you'll find non-state torture in there. You'll find human trafficking and quite a few different forms. Femicide is in there, child marriage is in there, different forms of violence against women and girls. And this is an ongoing research and a resource that will be built as more information and research becomes available. And this is just a quick image, if you will, of the covers of the books or the covers of the journals that we have articles in. And we show it because when we started, like I said earlier, we couldn't find any reference. So one of our goals was to make sure that there were references out there that people could access. And at the bottom with the orange border around it, we were in Geneva at the UN in Geneva a few years back. And we went to the Geneva Human Rights Library and the librarian asked us if we wanted to see how their library worked. And we said, sure. And she said, well, what is your interest? So we said non-state torture. So she put non-state torture up into their library system. And the first article that came up was one that Linda and I had been published, that we had submitted and had been published. So that was kind of a thrill for us to know that it had reached that far. And this summer, we have spent the last couple of years writing a book around our 28 years and all the models that we developed to try to understand the victimization and the ways that we had to help women heal. And we've written our journey in the book, and there's a great deal of women's voices in there because we worked on the healing becomes a work of theirs and of us and of society. So this is shared in our book, and like we say, we should be released sometime this summer. So as Linda said, we were not expecting to deal with non-state torture when we opened our practice in 1993. And as a consequence of deciding to support Sarah, we have for 28 years focused solely on non-state torture, victimization, traumatization, informed care, and the law. And this is our website and our contact. And again, you will find that in the handout. And that is the end.
So what I was thinking, Jeanne, is maybe what we could do, since there's not going to be a question and answer period because it's not live, it's taped, we can bring up some questions that normally people ask and try to answer them during these last few minutes of our time. And one of them that people ask a lot is, what happens, have any of the women taken their cases to court, and how that happened in court? Do you want to answer that question?
Well, none of the women that we know have taken their perpetrators to court in Canada, number one, because we don't have a law in Canada, even though Linda and I have worked really hard to try to get different political parties to change the law in Canada. They have refused to do this. They said that assault or aggravated assault is sufficient. So for me and for Linda, and in our book, we write that for us, this becomes political cruelty, really, that they're not listening to what women are trying to say. So in Canada, no, with no law, there's no crime, there's no victim, and there's no torture either, non-state torture. So for us in Canada, that's the way it is. In some places, in Queensland, Australia, they do have a law that would cover non-state actors or state actors. So they have used the law for families, perpetrators who have used torture in their relationships. And some of you may remember California and the 12 children that were tortured, and the crime was named as torture because there is a torture law in California. There's a torture law in Michigan that was a consequence of the serious torture of a woman who was blind and diabetic, who was tortured by her spouse. So we're not asking, and neither are the women who are saying, I want the law changed. They're not asking, and we're not asking for an unrealistic expectation. We're asking for respect for the human right that no one has the right to be subjected to torture.
And I can add to that, until you have a law in your country, by the way, there's quite a few countries that do have laws. They're pretty well generic laws. They don't name them as non-state torture, but they can apply to state or non-state. I can read some of them: Algeria, Armenia, Belgium, Brazil, Fiji, France, Georgia, Germany, Kenya, Malta, Montenegro, Romania, Rwanda, Russia, and Uganda. So those countries have laws that people could use for non-state torture if they wanted to take their perpetrator to court. But if you live in a country where there's no law against non-state torture and your perpetrators are very powerful people in the community, the women tell us they're just too terrified to go to court about the crimes because they feel they're not going to be believed or they're going to be discriminated against, which they have been, you see in our research. So they don't feel society is open and willing enough to hear their stories and believe them. So we have to do that. People ask us, this is the question I'm going to answer. People ask us, what can we do? And Jeanne gave you a lot of solutions about supporting them and saying torture if they ask and not abuse. But one of them you can do in your state or in your country, because this is an international conference, so I'm assuming there's people watching from other countries. You can go and start lobbying for a law against non-state torture. And as more and more countries develop laws against them, there will be a collective sense globally for women and girls who feel very ostracized and isolated now until there's a safe place for them to start talking about the crime and the human rights violations that they endure. One of the other questions, Jeanne, that people ask us is, why aren't we talking about men? Are there men that are being tortured or boys? And maybe you'd want to answer that question.
Well, we have had, like Linda said earlier in the presentation, we have had a few men who have contacted us and who have clearly described that they were tortured. And actually the women who have male siblings, they have also said that they realize that their male siblings they don't know if they were necessarily tortured, but they know they were harmed. And the way often that they were harmed is their parents enforced sexualized behaviors between a male sibling and a female sibling when they were very little, very destructive. And what that does with a sibling relationship, it fractures that relationship. So there's no support sibling to sibling. And that creates the aloneness, the powerlessness within the family system. And the other thing that happens that women have told us is that parents will scapegoat one child or make one child special. And here again, it fractures the ability of siblings to support one another and be able to try to find a way that they can prevent the harming of each other. So that becomes another issue. That's what jumps out immediately at me, Linda, when you ask that question. What would you add to that?
No, I think that's great. I didn't mention it earlier, so I think it was good to ask the question now. People also ask us how we survive because we've listened and supported and been activists for 28 years, how we cope with the ordeals that we've heard. And I can answer and then maybe give kind of a closing thought for me, and then maybe if you want to do the same, Jeanne. So for me, I think the fact that I was born into violence myself and knew that it was wrong when I was tiny, I knew my parents were both wrong in the way they were parenting me. It didn't, I grew up understanding that adults are wrong from a very little age. And I also learned about the Holocaust and the acts of evil in the Holocaust from about 7. So when I learned about non-state torture in families, I just added that worldview to my child view I think if you have that view as a child, it gives you a sense of resilience, that you can cope with the reality that this indeed does happen in families. And this is what I think I want to leave with, is the fact that people keep resisting the fact that families can be the traffickers, that pornographers can be the families. These women mostly are being harmed by the persons that so-called brought them into this world to care for them, but they did not care for them. They tortured them. And I think if we can get that message from this, it's important. And the second message is that I bring a lot of hope to the process, because I do believe that as a world, we will evolve to understand non-state torture differently than we do now, that Jeanne and I won't be talking to the abyss forever, that many of you out there will take this on and start recognizing it in your own communities, in your own work, and that women can heal, and they can heal from grave atrocities if we just treat them with respect, understanding if this is a human rights violation and a crime, not a mental illness. So the women have proved to us that in their healing, for instance, Elizabeth and Kelly and Jeanne and others that we've shared with you today, that healing is possible, but we have to care about them for them to heal. And that's our part of the responsibility. And I challenge you to do that.
Thank you, Linda. What was coming to me, I wanted to add another reflection about the need to truth tell. Because the women have been lied to repeatedly, it's very, very important that we tell the truth. Some of the questions that come to mind, women will say, well, is my body the same as your body? Because they can't perceive that. Some of the women don't even know they have skin. They don't perceive that they even have a physical being. So that is a very kind of natural question. So that's the truth telling. They have to be free to ask those questions, and the person listening has to be open to respectfully know that that's a very important question. Yes, my body and your body are the same. Is my inside the same as your inside? Yes, it is. The women, when Linda brought up human evil in our book, we do spend some of the chapters talking about acts of human evil. We're talking about people's behavior. It's very, very important that people understand that acts of human evil is about a person's behavior. It's intentional, it's never accidental. So the women have to know that their bodies are the same. They have to know about their mind. Women often think that their brain has been damaged in some way and maybe it can't heal, but it can. It's important to understand the neuroplasticity of the brain, and we've seen this with women when they change their belief system, they often have what they call brain pain. They can have sensations in their brain, so they may hear zapping sounds, or sometimes they tell us it feels a little bit watery. They have different sensations that the pain moves, and it's brain pain. It's not a headache, it's brain pain. They're very clear about that. So the reason I'm bringing in the brain pain, because Linda and I, because this was a whole paradigm shift for us, we also had brain pain. We talk about that too in our book, that our brain just seems like it was being stretched in ways that we had never exercised it before to try to develop the models and the care. So that was one way that for us, for me, and the healing is to understand my own physical sensations of looking at the world differently. So I would share that with you for anyone who comes across people who are willing to talk to you about non-state torture. If you have those kind of responses that you're feeling chilled, you're feeling shivery, you're feeling flu-like, or your brain, you're feeling you have brain pain, brain fog, those are normal responses. We often have that. People tell us that when we present, that there takes 2 or 3 days for them to integrate the knowledge that we've shared today. And this is a beginning, if you will, session to start understanding. So I'm seeing that we have 3 minutes left. So I guess with the 3 minutes, I'll share that for me. I guess like Linda, I was born into family violence. It was a reality that was spoken out there. My father's violence was very public. There was no secrecy about it. I was never told to be quiet about it, so always talked about it. And this is indeed what is necessary with the non-state torture, the freedom to talk about it, to stop the intergenerational harm that goes on. If we don't talk about it, tell the truth about it, listen to the truth, then the intergenerational victimization continues. And that is another aspect that we've learned, that how important it is to be present, to be open, to be truth-telling, even if you think the person doesn't want to hear the truth. It's very important that we tell the truth about something that we like or dislike, we disagree with the person who's trying to do something that you disagree with. You have to say, I disagree, that's my truth, and explain why. So if there are any questions in the future, if you look at our presentation, you have our handout and you have our connection. So please do contact us. So thank you very much. And I wish great success to all the presenters and all the people who access all the presenters on this conference.
And I want to thank everyone as well and say that it's been a great honor for me to share the work that Jeanne and I have developed, and also to share the women's stories, because we hold them with pride and with respect, and we thank them always when we speak. And I hope that some of them, you can share our webinar with them and give them hope as well, because that's what we're doing this work for them and for the little children that are still trapped in these horrific families. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda and Jeanne. Attendees, please remember to complete the evaluation related to this session. The recording of this session will be available for review up until July 31st, 2021. For information about evaluations or accreditation, please email Megan Bach at mbaak@conferencecaw.org. Thank you, everyone.